The most feared killer in the galaxy had never failed a hunt, until today. The creature known only as the Harbinger moved through the ruins of a shattered world. Silent. Precise. Unstoppable. For centuries, it had hunted without question, without error. No prey had ever escaped it. No species had ever survived an encounter. Until now. Its senses flared as it tracked the last living being on this planet, a lone survivor, barely clinging to life. This should have been over already. A single swipe of its talons, a flash of its razor-sharp fangs, and it would be done. Yet, something was wrong. The Harbinger had hesitated. Its prey was unlike any other. Human. Dead planet, dying survivor. The sky above was a swirling haze of dying embers. What had once been a thriving colony was now reduced to nothing but smoldering ruins. The air reeked of burned metal and ionized ash. Crumbling towers loomed like skeletal remains of a civilization lost. Deep within the wreckage, a figure dragged themselves forward, struggling for every breath. Their body was battered, their suit torn, but they refused to stop. The Harbinger watched from the shadows, its predatory instincts honed to perfection. Yet, as it prepared to strike, an unfamiliar sensation crawled through its being. It was neither fear nor doubt, something deeper, something wrong. This was supposed to be just another kill. Just another hunt. But for the first time in its existence, it hesitated. The first mistake. The human reached the remnants of a broken structure, gasping for air. Their movements were calculated, but there was no panic. Instead of blindly running, they seemed to be waiting. Anticipating. The Harbinger narrowed its gaze. No prey had ever done this before. Then, without warning. Boom! The ground beneath it exploded. A well-placed charge, hidden beneath the rubble. The Harbinger was thrown backward, its body slamming into the crumbling walls. For the first time, it felt the unfamiliar sting of pain. The human turned, their voice hoarse but filled with defiance. You hesitated. The words rang in the predator's mind, something stirring deep within its core. Prey did not speak to it. Prey did not challenge it. But this was no ordinary prey. This was a human. And for the first time in its long, merciless existence, the Harbinger was afraid. The Harbinger had never known pain. For as long as it had existed, it had moved through the galaxy as a force of nature, unstoppable, merciless, and inevitable. Entire civilizations had fallen before its silent hunt. Yet now, for the first time, it felt something it had never encountered before: vulnerability. Smoke and debris clouded its vision as it staggered to its feet, its exoskeletal plating cracked from the explosion. The human had anticipated its movements. Had set a trap. No other species had ever done this. The Harbinger's bioluminescent eyes flickered as it refocused on its target. The human stood just ahead, gripping a piece of scavenged metal like a weapon. Their stance was weak, their body injured, but their gaze was steady. They weren't running. They were waiting. A perfect killer, a fatal flaw. The Harbinger recalculated. It should have struck instantly, tearing the human apart before they had a chance to react. But it hadn't. It had hesitated. And the human had used that hesitation against it. The Harbinger knew every species in the galaxy. It had hunted creatures capable of moving faster than light, beings that could crush warships with a thought. But humans? They were fragile. Their bones broke easily. Their soft bodies could not withstand harsh environments. They should not have survived among the stars. Yet, they had. Not through strength, but through something else. Something the Harbinger did not understand. And that lack of understanding was dangerous. Hunter's instinct versus human will. The Harbinger lunged forward, talons slicing through the air, but the human was already moving. They dived into the wreckage, disappearing beneath the rubble before the Harbinger could strike. Its claws slammed into the broken metal, sending sparks flying. Frustration flared in its mind. It was supposed to be the perfect hunter. Its prey had never escaped before. A sharp whine echoed through the ruins. The Harbinger turned just in time to see the human holding a modified plasma cutter, aimed directly at its exposed chest plate. They fired. A searing bolt of energy slammed into the Harbinger's side, burning through its armor. It roared in pain, stumbling backward. The human's breath was ragged, but they stood their ground. "You don't know why you hesitated, do you?" they rasped. The Harbinger's mind raced. No. It did not. And that terrified it. A terrifying realization. For the first time, the Harbinger was not the one in control. The hunt had changed. This was no longer a simple act of predator and prey. The human was not just running. They were fighting back. And somehow, impossibly, they were winning. The Harbinger's injuries were minor, but they were still injuries. It was vulnerable. The human was forcing it into a position it had never been in before, a fight it could actually lose. It had come to this world to exterminate the last survivor. But now? It wasn't certain it could. The human narrowed their eyes. "You want to know why you hesitated?" The Harbinger didn't answer. It couldn't. The human took a step closer. "Because for the first time in your existence, you're afraid of something." The words sent a ripple of something foreign through the Harbinger's mind. Fear. A concept it had never understood. Never even considered possible. The human smirked grimly. "And you should be." Because the Harbinger wasn't hunting anymore. Now, it was the one being hunted. The Harbinger had always believed itself to be perfect. It had no equals, no rivals, only prey. Its kind had scoured the stars, eradicating entire species before they even knew they were being hunted. It had never known failure. Yet now, standing wounded in the ruins of its own hunt, it was faced with an undeniable truth. Humans were different. And worse, it was afraid of one. The human's gamble. The survivor, this fragile, wounded creature, stood firm, gripping their makeshift weapon. They should have been desperate. They should have been cowering. Instead, they were waiting. The Harbinger calculated the odds. The human had proven to be unpredictable, resourceful, and, most disturbingly, willing to fight when every other species would have accepted death. Even now, as they bled from their injuries, there was no fear in their eyes. What was this defiance? The Harbinger lunged, determined to erase the anomaly. The human dived again, using the wreckage as cover. The Harbinger's claws slashed through the air, raking against the debris. They should have been trapped. But instead... Boom! An explosion erupted from the wreckage as the human triggered an old fuel cell, sending a shockwave through the battlefield. The Harbinger was thrown backward, its exoskeleton cracking further as it crashed against the ruins. Smoke filled the air. Sparks rained down. The human emerged, coughing, staggering, but victorious. "You hesitate because you think you're superior," they muttered, leveling the plasma cutter again. "But guess what? That's your weakness. A creature that shouldn't exist." The Harbinger's mind reeled. Weakness? It had no weaknesses. It was designed to be the perfect killer, an apex predator with no flaws. But the human's words unsettled it. Because why had it hesitated? Why had it not struck the human down the moment it had the chance? The answer was as simple as it was horrifying. It had underestimated them. The Harbinger had never encountered prey that adapted so quickly. That learned mid-battle. That turned disadvantages into weapons. And now, with every second that passed, the human was becoming more dangerous. The fear it cannot name. The Harbinger surged forward again, trying to overwhelm the human with sheer speed, only to be met with another attack. This time, the human had used a piece of shattered hull plating to reflect light from a nearby fire, blinding the Harbinger for a split second. The human struck. A jagged metal rod, scavenged from the wreckage, was driven deep into the Harbinger's exposed side. The pain was immediate, sharp, and alien. The Harbinger howled, staggering backward. The human didn't stop. They twisted the makeshift weapon, driving it deeper, their expression set with grim determination. For the first time in its existence, the Harbinger was on the defensive. The turning point. The Harbinger knew it could still win. It was stronger, faster, and deadlier than any human could ever be. But something fundamental had changed. This wasn't a hunt anymore. This was a battle. A battle the Harbinger was no longer sure it could win. Because the human wasn't just fighting with weapons. They were fighting with something far more terrifying. Something no predator in the galaxy had ever faced before. Sheer, relentless willpower. A dangerous new path. The Harbinger did something it had never done before. It stepped back. Not out of strategy. Not out of necessity. But out of fear. And the human saw it. Their smirk was bloody, but their voice was steady. Not so invincible now, are you? The Harbinger's claws flexed. Its mind screamed at it to attack, to end the human now before they became an even greater threat. But a new, terrifying thought took root instead. If one human could do this, what would happen if more of them knew? The Harbinger had spent its existence hunting. Now, for the first time, it had a reason to run. The Harbinger had never retreated before. It was bred for war. Engineered for perfection. Forged in the fires of 1,000 conquests. And yet, for the first time, it was running. The impossible defeat. The battlefield was a ruined graveyard of twisted metal and scorched earth. Smoke curled from the wreckage, the scent of burnt fuel thick in the air. The human stood amid the carnage, battered and bloodied, but still standing. The Harbinger, however, had stepped back. It told itself this was temporary. A calculated decision. A tactical retreat to reassess the anomaly that was this lone human. But deep down, in the cold recesses of its mind, the Harbinger knew the truth. It was afraid. Not of the human's weapons. Not of their injuries. But of the thing inside them, that relentless, unbreakable defiance. The Harbinger had slaughtered countless species, reducing civilizations to nothing more than whispers in the void. But none had ever fought like this. None had ever survived this long. The human's pursuit. The Harbinger moved swiftly, its body weaving through the wreckage, seeking an opportunity to disappear into the darkened landscape. Survival required distance. But then. What's the matter? Not so eager now? The human's voice rang through the ruin like a taunt, filled with grim amusement. The Harbinger turned, locking eyes with them. The human was following. It was absurd. Prey did not chase predators. And yet, here they were, limping, wounded, relentless. I thought you were some big, unstoppable nightmare. Turns out you're just another bully who panics when things don't go your way. Something twisted inside the Harbinger. A deep, primal reaction it couldn't name. The human wasn't just trying to fight it anymore. They were challenging it. The weakness it cannot escape. The Harbinger's instinct screamed at it to turn and fight. To reclaim its dominance. To prove this was a fluke, a mistake that would be erased with one swift, decisive strike. But it hesitated. Because if it lost again, what would that mean for the rest of its kind? Its species had ruled the stars with merciless efficiency. They had never encountered resistance they could not crush. If one human had figured out their weakness, What if others could, too? The thought chilled the harbinger more than the human's blade. It could not allow that knowledge to spread. The desperate counterattack. Rage surged through the harbinger, drowning out the alien sensation of doubt. This would end now. It launched forward, moving faster than before, its claws slicing through the air like death itself. It would not toy with the human this time. It would strike with all its strength, with every ounce of power its kind had cultivated over millennia. The human braced themselves. And then, they did something completely unexpected. They smiled. Not in fear. Not in desperation. But in understanding. The harbinger saw it a second too late. A trap. Turning the tables. A single step was all it took. The harbinger's weight shifted forward just as the human yanked a torn length of wiring from the wreckage, pulling it taut between two collapsed beams. The harbinger's momentum carried it straight into the snare. The wire snapped tight, tangling its limbs. It twisted, trying to break free, only to realize this was more than just debris. The human had set this up minutes ago. Planned for it. Lured it. And now, the harbinger was trapped. A predator's worst nightmare. The human approached slowly, their breathing ragged but steady. They stood just beyond the harbinger's reach, observing it with something new in their gaze. Not fear. Not hatred. Pity. You never expected this, did you? They muttered. No one ever stood up to you. No one ever fought back. The harbinger snarled, struggling harder against the trap. The bindings cut into its exoskeleton. It should have been able to snap free. But the angle, the leverage, it was all wrong. The human stepped closer. Thing is, you're not unstoppable. You never were. People just assumed you were. And that's why you won. Their voice dropped lower, steady and certain. But I know the truth now. You're just another creature trying to survive. You're not a god. You bleed. You break. The harbinger froze. Because, deep down, it knew they were right. The harbinger was no longer the hunter. It was trapped, caught in its own arrogance, its every move a desperate attempt to escape. The human stood before it, a figure of defiance and resilience, their makeshift weapon still hanging loosely at their side. Mercy. That was what the human had shown, something the harbinger had never understood. It had conquered galaxies, obliterated entire species, and yet now, it was at the mercy of one human. The unexpected bond. The silence between them was heavy, thick with an unspoken understanding. The harbinger's pulse quickened as the human, though battered and bruised, refused to make the killing blow. Instead, they crouched down, their eyes locked onto the creature's. You know, the human said, their voice softer now, you've been fighting a war that wasn't yours. The harbinger growled in response, but it felt different. It wasn't the aggressive sound of a predator preparing for battle. This growl was frustration, a feeling it hadn't experienced in centuries. The human continued, their voice growing quieter with each word. I get it. You've been programmed to do this. To kill. To destroy. But, is that really all you are? The harbinger's eyes narrowed. It had never considered this. It had never questioned its purpose. It had never been taught to question anything. Its instincts were its law, its survival its sole focus. But the human, standing there before it, was forcing it to see beyond its narrow existence. The first crack in the armor. You're not a machine, the human said, almost as if to themselves, you're something else. And you're not alone in this galaxy. There's more to life than just destruction. The words hung in the air, impossible to ignore. Something shifted within the harbinger. It was a small change, imperceptible to anyone else, but it was there. In the deep recesses of its mind, a question began to form, could it change? Could it be more than a weapon? The alien conundrum. As the hours passed, the human continued to speak, about hope, about survival, about the incredible resilience of humanity in the face of the most unimaginable odds. They shared stories of their own struggles, their pain, and how they had pushed through it all. There was no anger in their voice, just raw, unfiltered honesty. The Harbinger listened, not out of interest, but because it had no other choice. It had been designed to endure, to survive at any cost, but now it was being forced to endure something else, self-reflection. The creature's mind began to fracture. The long-held beliefs it had clung to, about its superiority, its invincibility, began to crumble. It was as if the very core of its existence was being challenged. But the Harbinger couldn't let go. It couldn't just accept the idea of weakness, of humanity's potential. A shift in perspective. The human, seeing the creature's internal struggle, made a choice. "I'll help you," they said. "But you need to help me too." The words took the Harbinger by surprise. In all its years of destruction, no one had ever offered help. It had never needed it. "You're not alone anymore," the human continued, their voice calm. "If you want to survive this, if you want to understand what's beyond killing, you need to trust me." The Harbinger was silent, its eyes never leaving the human. It was an impossible request. But then, in that stillness, something inside the Harbinger began to respond. For the first time, the creature wasn't just thinking about survival. It was thinking about what came next. What could come next? The pact of survival. "I'll teach you," the human said, offering their hand in a gesture of trust. "I'll show you that you don't have to be a monster. You can be something different." The Harbinger hesitated. There was so much it had been taught about domination. And yet, this human was showing it a different way. A way that didn't involve fear, or bloodshed. For the first time in its life, the Harbinger felt something stir inside it that was far more dangerous than anything it had ever encountered: hope. The turning point. The Harbinger, its claws still bound by the human's trap, watched as the human lowered their weapon further. This wasn't a surrender. It wasn't weakness. It was an offer of understanding. The Harbinger had only ever known how to take. But now, it was being offered something it had never dreamed of: an alliance, a partnership. The creature's eyes met the human's, and for the first time, they saw each other as equals. "I will help you," the Harbinger said, its voice rough, hesitant, but filled with a strange resolve. "But I need to learn." The days following the Harbinger's decision to accept the human's help were difficult, filled with tension and uncertainty. What had once been a battle between life and death was now a partnership between two beings from vastly different worlds. The alliance was fragile, held together by the belief that change was possible, but also by the shared reality that they both had enemies who would stop at nothing to tear them apart. Training the unwilling. The first challenge came when the Harbinger was introduced to the concept of human emotions. The creature, with its cold, calculated mind, struggled to comprehend something so alien. Fear, empathy, love, these were abstract concepts to it, ones that had no place in its existence as a weapon. Yet, the human patiently began to teach, explaining each emotion with simplicity, showing the Harbinger how they could be used, not as weaknesses, but as strengths. "It's not just about survival anymore," the human said one evening, as they sat around a fire, the Harbinger's eyes locked on the flames. "It's about connection. About living, not just existing." But the Harbinger was not so easily convinced. It had lived for so long with only one purpose: to conquer, to destroy. How could anything as fragile as human emotion be a tool for survival? The idea seemed absurd. But the human did not give up. Slowly, they began to show the Harbinger the nuances of life that they had long taken for granted, the way a kind word could change the course of a day, how a smile could forge alliances, how compassion could heal wounds that physical strength could never touch. The creature, though reluctant at first, started to see the subtle power that lay in those small acts. An unexpected test. However, no lesson prepared them for the day the first real test came. It was a simple mission, scouting a nearby planet that had fallen under the rule of an aggressive alien race, the Zarnok. The Zarnok had a reputation for brutality and dominance, and they were determined to stamp out any signs of rebellion. The human and the Harbinger had agreed to work together, using the human's knowledge of diplomacy and the Harbinger's strength to infiltrate the Zarnok's stronghold. But as they approached the planet, the Harbinger felt the familiar pull of violence. The mission was simple: destroy the Zarnok forces and leave nothing behind. The human, sensing the change in the Harbinger, looked at it with a steady gaze. "You don't have to do this," the human said, their voice calm yet firm. "You can choose another way." The Harbinger hesitated. The instinct to fight, to destroy, screamed inside it. The Zarnok had always been the enemy, there was no room for negotiation with them. They were beasts. The human's words, however, echoed in its mind: "It's about connection, not destruction." Could it really set aside its training, its very nature, and do what the human suggested? The temptation of power. The Harbinger stood there, torn between two paths. One led to the destruction it had always known, where the enemy would fall at its feet and victory would be unquestioned. The other was uncertain, based on trust, negotiation, and the hope that something more could be built. But the Zarnok were closing in. The time for thinking was running out. The Harbinger's eyes narrowed. It was not used to weakness, to waiting. It wanted to strike, to fight. But as it looked at the human, standing confidently by its side, unwavering in their resolve, a strange sensation began to rise within it. Could it really give up its past? A choice in the face of danger. As the Zarnok forces appeared, the humans stepped forward, holding their ground. "This isn't your fight," the human said, addressing the advancing enemy. "We're not here to kill. We're here to find peace." The Zarnok leader, a massive figure towering over the others, let out a guttural laugh. "Peace? There is no peace for creatures like you." The Harbinger's fists clenched, and it could feel the violence stirring again. "Kill them," it urged itself. "Crush them all." But something inside it held back. The human was not cowering. They were standing tall, speaking words that the Harbinger had never even considered. It was as though the human was fighting not with weapons, but with a power that the Harbinger could never hope to understand. "I won't let you destroy what I've built," the human said, their voice filled with resolve. "We don't need to kill each other." A moment of clarity. The leader of the Zarnok raised their weapon, ready to strike. But before they could fire, the Harbinger stepped forward, positioning itself between the human and the enemy. The tension in the air was palpable. The Harbinger's body trembled, every instinct screaming for it to strike first. But instead, it spoke. "We will not fight you. We will talk. If you wish to destroy, you will have to destroy me first." The Zarnok leader snarled, clearly unsure how to react to this unexpected stance. The Harbinger's voice was calm but unwavering, a strange confidence that had never been present before. It was no longer just a killer. It was a being choosing its own path. The aftermath. The standoff lasted for hours, each side wary of the other. Eventually, the Zarnok, realizing they could not easily overpower the Harbinger and the human, retreated. They were not used to being outwitted by their prey. As the enemy left, the human looked at the Harbinger, their eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and pride. "You did it," the human said softly. "You made the choice." The Harbinger, though silent, felt something stir inside. It was not victory, not the rush of battle, but something deeper, a sense of pride in having made the right choice. The days after the Harbinger's choice were filled with uneasy peace. The Zarnok were no longer an immediate threat, but their retreat was only temporary. The larger universe, with its countless factions and rivalries, was beginning to take notice of the unusual alliance between a human and the galaxy's most feared weapon. Whispers spread like wildfire, and soon, the Harbinger was a figure that no one dared ignore. New threats emerge. In the heart of a distant star system, on a cold, desolate moon, a shadowy council gathered. It was a place where the most ruthless beings in the galaxy convened, an alliance formed not by loyalty, but by the shared understanding that power and dominance were the only laws that mattered. The Harbinger, once their tool, was now something different. It had taken the side of the humans, an act that was seen as a betrayal by those who had relied on it. And so, they began to make plans to deal with this new threat. "We cannot let it live," one of the council members said, their voice low and threatening. "If the Harbinger and this human are allowed to survive, they will change everything. They must be stopped." An impossible alliance. Word of the council's decision soon reached the human and the Harbinger. Despite their growing bond, they knew that their current path would not be without its dangers. Their enemies were vast, and their own strength was limited. They needed allies, people willing to stand with them, despite the odds. It was a gamble, but the human insisted that they reach out to the very beings who had once been their enemies, those who had suffered under the cruelty of the same factions that now threatened them. Together, the human and the Harbinger began to forge an alliance of the oppressed, an unlikely group of rebels, outcasts, and survivors, united not by race or species, but by the shared desire to see the universe free from the tyranny of those who would rule through fear. A test of leadership. The first real test of this fragile alliance came sooner than expected. The Council sent its forces, ships that blotted out the stars, warriors who had known only conquest, sent to crush the rebel forces and reassert control. The human and the Harbinger knew that this was a battle they could not afford to lose. As the enemy ships descended upon them, the humans stood before the newly formed alliance, their voice steady but urgent. "This is it. We fight for the future of our worlds, our freedom. We can win, if we fight together." The Harbinger, standing silently beside the human, felt the weight of the moment. It had spent so long being the weapon, the destroyer, but now, it had to be more. It had to be the protector, the symbol of what humanity had taught it, that strength could be wielded for something greater than domination.